This wasn't just royal drama, this was a calculated chess move disguised as love, ambition, and rebellion. A silent war where Meghan Markle didn't just enter the palace, she allegedly walked in with a plan that insiders claim was aimed straight at Prince William and everything that stood between her and the throne's spotlight. The gates of Buckingham Palace have seen scandals before. Betrayals, whispers, secrets buried under velvet carpets. But what unfolded when Meghan stepped into that world? It didn't feel like history repeating itself. It felt like something far more deliberate, far more surgical. According to explosive insights tied to Tom Bower, this wasn't a cultural clash. It wasn't Hollywood versus monarchy. It was something colder, something calculated, a slow infiltration of power dynamics that had stood untouched for centuries. Because here's where the story twists. Meghan didn't allegedly see the monarchy as a system to respect. She saw it as a structure to challenge. And at the center of that structure stood William, not just a brother, not just a future king, but the ultimate gatekeeper of everything she could never bypass through charm alone. And that's where the tension ignited. Quietly at first, almost invisible, but dangerously real. Think about it. The monarchy operates on hierarchy, on birthright, on rules that don't bend for personality, talent, or charisma. And yet, insiders suggest Meghan didn't just question those rules, she resented them. Deeply. Why should William stand above simply because he was born first? Why should Prince Harry remain in the shadow when, in her narrative, he was the more compelling figure? That question didn't stay a question. It became a narrative. A narrative where Harry was no longer the spare, but the victim. And Meghan, she became the liberator. But here's where it gets unsettling. Because behind the polished smiles and carefully staged public appearances, something else was allegedly happening. A tension that wasn't loud but sharp. A discomfort that didn't explode but lingered. Especially around one figure, Catherine, Princess of Wales. Now pause for a second. This wasn't just about personality differences. It wasn't about friendliness or warmth. According to insiders and observations attributed to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, this was about hierarchy, about position, about who stands where and who bows to whom. And Meghan, she reportedly didn't accept that she was meant to stand behind Catherine, not socially. Not symbolically, not at all. That refusal didn't scream rebellion. It whispered it through moments that seemed small but felt loaded, standing a little too close, lingering a little too long, touches that blurred the invisible lines of royal protocol. To the outside world, these gestures could look harmless, even warm. But inside palace walls, they reportedly triggered something else entirely. Unease, suspicion, a sense that these weren't accidents, they were signals. Signals of equality or something more provocative, because in a system where even the distance between two people reflects power, every step forward becomes a statement. And according to whispers circulating through royal corridors, William noticed. He didn't react loudly. He didn't confront publicly, but he saw. And more importantly, he understood. And that understanding may have shaped everything that followed. Because here's the part people don't talk about enough. Before the narrative centered on Harry, before the emotional storyline of rescue and escape took over, there were claims that Meghan initially tried to engage closer to William's circle. Not romantically, but strategically. Because if you understand power, you don't ignore the center of it. You approach it. You study it. You test it. And William, he didn't fall for it. Instead, he stepped back. Quietly, firmly, building a distance that wasn't dramatic but unmistakable. And insiders suggest that moment, that quiet rejection, may have been the real turning point, the spark behind everything that followed. Because from that point forward, the narrative didn't just shift, it sharpened. Suddenly, William wasn't just the future king. He became, in Meghan's constructed reality, the symbol of everything holding Harry back. The face of an institution that, in her version of the story, didn't just limit but oppressed. And slowly, almost invisibly, that idea began to grow. Not overnight, not loudly, but steadily. Conversations changed, perceptions shifted, and somewhere in that shift, Harry's lifelong bond with his brother started to crack. Not because of one argument, not because of one moment, but because of something far more dangerous, a rewritten reality. And the question that lingers, the one no one inside the palace could openly ask, was this transformation organic or orchestrated? Because if you look closely, if you follow the patterns, the timing, timing, the subtle escalations, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like design. And that's where things stop being emotional and start becoming strategic, because this wasn't just about entering the royal family. This was about redefining it, or walking away with something bigger. And just when it seemed like the cracks between Prince William and Prince Harry were still repairable, something shifted, something deeper, something far more calculated that insiders describe not as an argument but as a complete rewiring of perception. Because what unfolded next wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was silent, methodical, and almost impossible to detect from the outside, yet devastating from within, as Meghan Markle allegedly transitioned from being a new entrant in the royal system to becoming the very lens through which Harry began to see that system. And that is where everything changed. Because according to the investigative threads tied to Tom Bower, this wasn't just influence. It was something far more precise. A slow construction of a reality filter where every interaction, every piece of advice, every gesture from William was no longer neutral. It was reinterpreted, reframed, and repackaged into something darker, something threatening, something that suggested William wasn't protecting Harry, but controlling him. And once that seed was planted, it didn't stay small. It grew, it spread, it reshaped the emotional architecture of a brotherhood that had survived decades of pressure, loss, and public scrutiny, until suddenly the unthinkable became believable. That the same brother who once walked behind their mother's coffin was now seen as part of the very system that had failed her. And that shift didn't happen by accident. It happened through repetition, through emotional triggers, through carefully placed parallels, especially the echoes of Princess Diana. Because once Diana's story was woven into Meghan's narrative, everything became heavier. Every disagreement became symbolic. Every concern from William became suspicious. And Harry, already carrying unresolved grief, didn't just hear those parallels, he felt them deeply, instinctively, almost protectively. And that's where the real fracture began. Not in public, not in headlines, but in private moments where trust quietly eroded. Because if you can convince someone that history is repeating itself, you don't need to argue anymore. You just need to remind them of the pain they already carry. And according to the same internal observations linked to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, this shift wasn't just emotional, it became structural. Because communication itself began to change. Direct conversations between the brothers reportedly faded, replaced by filtered messages, controlled interactions, delayed responses, until eventually what was once a natural bond became something strained, something managed, something almost mediated. And that's when the palace stopped being a shared home and started feeling like two separate worlds operating under the same roof, one grounded in duty, tradition, and long-term stability, and the other driven by narrative, perception, and global positioning. And as this divide widened, even the smallest incidents began to carry disproportionate weight. Disagreements that once would have been brushed aside now became evidence, proof of bias, proof of hostility, proof that the system itself was against them. And the most dangerous part of that transformation was that it didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like awakening, like clarity, like finally seeing the truth. And once someone believes they've woken up, it becomes almost impossible to convince them otherwise, because every opposing voice becomes part of the problem. Every attempt to intervene becomes confirmation of the narrative. And William, bound by a role that demanded restraint, couldn't fight back in the way most people would. He couldn't publicly defend himself. He couldn't expose private conversations. He couldn't break the code that had defined royal conduct for generations. And that silence, that disciplined stillness, became its own weapon against him. Because in a narrative built on perception, silence doesn't look like dignity. It looks like guilt. It looks like avoidance. It looks like something to hide. And that's exactly where the balance tipped. Because while William chose restraint, Meghan allegedly chose amplification, building a version of events where she and Harry weren't just misunderstood, they were targeted, where every critique became prejudice, every protocol became oppression, and every boundary became rejection. And once that framework was in place, it didn't just justify distance, it demanded it. Because why stay in a system that you believe is working against you? Why maintain ties with people you now see as obstacles? And just like that, the narrative of escape began to form, not as a sudden decision, but as the inevitable conclusion of a story that had been carefully shaped over time, a A story where leaving wasn't abandonment, it was survival. Where stepping away wasn't betrayal, it was liberation. And yet, if you strip away the emotion, if you step back and look at the sequence, the patterns, the timing, it raises a question that refuses to stay quiet. Was this truly an organic unraveling or the execution of a plan that had been unfolding from the very beginning? Because the outcome was too precise, too aligned with a new identity, a new brand, a new platform far removed from the constraints of royal duty. And as the Sussexes moved toward California, building a life that revolved around media, influence, and global narratives, the monarchy itself didn't collapse. It didn't bend. It didn't even respond in the way many expected. Instead, it tightened, it stabilized, and at the center of that stability stood William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, embodying the very stillness that Meghan reportedly rejected, continuing their roles with a consistency that felt almost deliberate, almost like a counter-narrative built not through words, but through presence, through continuity, through the quiet. The reinforcement of a system that doesn't react, it endures, and that's what makes this entire story so unsettling, because there is no clear ending, no definitive resolution, just two narratives moving in parallel, one driven by exposure, reinvention, and public storytelling, and the other by silence, duty, and long-term legacy. And somewhere between those two realities lies the truth, a truth that hasn't fully surfaced yet. Because if this was a plan, if this was strategy, then the most important chapter hasn't even been written. And the real question isn't what happened inside those palace walls, it's what happens next. Because stories like this don't just end, they evolve, they resurface, they reveal themselves in fragments, and right now, the silence coming from one side feels just as loud as the accusations from the other.